The reflection in the bistro window showed a woman who looked far more confident than she actually felt, with the sleek fabric of the red sleeveless dress hugging Keisha's frame in a way that made her feel both powerful and terribly exposed. She was 25, successful in her career as a graphic illustrator, and completely terrified of this blind date, mostly because the man she was meeting had no idea she was deaf. She had debated telling him beforehand, typing and deleting the message a dozen times, but her friends had insisted that she should just let him meet her first so he could see the vibrant, intelligent woman she was before a label could get in the way. Now, sitting at the small table with the candlelight flickering against a crystal water glass, she felt the vibrations of the busy restaurant through the floorboards, the heavy footsteps of waiters, the rhythmic thrum of music she couldn't hear, and the general chaotic energy of a Friday night in the city. When the man finally arrived, a tall figure with a sharp jawline and an expensive suit, Keisha offered a warm, welcoming smile and gestured for him to sit, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He sat down, looking at his watch immediately, and began speaking rapidly, his lips moving too fast for her to catch every word in the dim light. Keisha reached for her phone, where she had pre-typed a gentle introduction explaining her deafness and her reliance on lip reading, but before she could even slide the device across the white tablecloth, he frowned, realizing she hadn't responded to his opening question. She pointed to her ear and then to the phone, her smile faltering just a fraction as she watched his expression shift from indifference to annoyance, and finally to a cold, hard mask of discomfort. He didn't even read the screen. He simply stood up, muttered something that looked like, "This isn't what I signed up for," and walked away without a backward glance, leaving Keisha sitting alone in her beautiful red dress while the heat of humiliation crept up her neck and burned her cheeks. She froze, unable to move, feeling the heavy stares of the diners around her who had witnessed the rejection, her hands trembling in her lap as she fought the stinging tears that threatened to ruin her makeup. Keisha took a deep, shaky breath, staring strictly at the napkin in her lap because looking up meant seeing the pity in the eyes of strangers, and she refused to let them see her cry over a man who wasn't worth a single second of her time. She was calculating the logistics of leaving, how to signal the waiter, how to pay for water she hadn't touched, and how to walk to the door with her head held high, when a hand gently entered her field of vision, not touching her, but tapping on the table to catch her attention. Keisha looked up, startled, to find an elderly Asian woman standing there, dressed in an immaculate, deep green dress that looked like it was made of vintage silk, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant, severe bun. The woman's face was wrinkled with age, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and currently filled with a fierce sort of kindness that made Keisha pause. The woman didn't speak. Instead, she raised her hands and signed, her movements fluid and practiced. He was a fool with a cheap suit and a cheaper heart. Keisha's eyes widened in genuine shock, her own hands coming up instinctively to sign back. "You know, sign?" The older woman smiled, a mischievous glint in her eye, and nodded before signing. "I've been deaf since I was a girl, just like you, and I have eyes that see everything." Before Keisha could process this miraculous intervention, a shadow fell over the table, and she looked up to see a man standing behind the old woman, a man who made the previous date look like a child playing dress-up. He was Korean, perhaps in his early 30s, with hair swept back from a forehead that bore the faint lines of high-stress decisions, wearing a black suit that was tailored to perfection. He looked dangerous, undeniably so, with a stillness about him that screamed authority, yet when he looked down at the woman in the green dress, his expression softened into something profoundly tender. The woman signed to him rapidly, pointing at Keisha and then at the empty chair where the rejecta had sat, and the man looked at Keisha, his dark eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He didn't speak to her verbally. Instead, he tapped his mother's shoulder, said something in Korean that Keisha couldn't read, and then looked back at Keisha. To her absolute astonishment, the mother turned back to her and signed, "My son says you look like a queen who lost a jester, and he asks, can we join you?" The transition from solitary humiliation to sharing a table with two complete strangers was surreal, yet it felt strangely inevitable, as if the universe was correcting a mistake it had made minutes prior. The man, whose name was June, pulled out the chair for his mother, whom he called Iyama, and then took the seat across from Keisha, his presence dominating the small space in a way that was protective rather than threatening. The waiter appeared almost instantly, looking nervous and bowing slightly deeper to June than he had to anyone else in the room, a detail Keisha filed away but didn't dwell on as June ordered a bottle of wine that she knew cost more than her rent. The dynamic at the table was fascinating. The mother, Mrs. Park, was the bridge between them, her hands flying with stories and questions, ignoring the food that arrived to interrogate Keisha about her life, her job, and her opinions on the restaurant's decor. Keisha found herself laughing, a genuine, bubbling sound that released the tension of the evening as she signed back answers, explaining her work as an illustrator and her love for visual storytelling. June sat quietly for the most part, watching the exchange with a small, guarded smile, his eyes darting to the perimeter of the room occasionally, but always returning to Keisha's face. He knew enough sign language to follow the conversation, occasionally interjecting with a sign or two, but mostly he let his mother hold court. At one point, Mrs. Park signed, "My son works too much. He has no time for dates, so I have to find beauty for him," causing June to cover his face with one hand and shake his head while Keisha giggled. It wasn't just the fact that they were inclusive. It was that for the first time in her dating life, her deafness wasn't a hurdle to be cleared or a problem to be solved, but rather the very thing that had invited this connection. When Keisha struggled to cut a piece of steak because she was laughing so hard at Mrs. Park's impression of the rude date, June reached over without a word, took her plate, cut the meat into perfect, bite-sized pieces, and placed it back in front of her, his eyes locking with hers for a second longer than necessary. As the dinner wound down and the dessert plates were cleared away, the reality of the evening began to settle in, accompanied by a new kind of curiosity about who exactly June was. There was a heaviness to the way the staff treated him, a deferential fear that clashed with the gentle way he wiped a crumb from his mother's cheek, and Keisha noticed that two men in dark suits had been standing near the entrance the entire time, their eyes scanning the room constantly. When June signaled for the check, the manager rushed over to wave it away, insisting it was on the house, but June simply placed a stack of cash on the table, far more than the meal was worth, and stood up, buttoning his jacket with a definitive snap. "I will drive you home," he said, his voice deep and smooth, the first time he had spoken English directly to her, and though it was phrased as a statement, his eyes asked for permission. Keisha looked at Mrs. Park, who was nodding enthusiastically, signing "Go, go. He is a good driver, very safe," and found herself nodding agreement. Walking out of the restaurant felt entirely different than walking in. She was flanked by June and his mother, and the crowd that had witnessed her rejection now watched her leave with a man who exuded power and wealth. Outside, the air was crisp, and a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb instantly, the driver jumping out to open the door for Mrs. Park. June waited, offering his hand to Keisha to help her into the back seat, his grip firm and warm, sending a jolt of electricity up her arm that made her shiver. Inside the car, it was quiet and smelled of leather and expensive cologne, a sanctuary from the noise of the city. Mrs. Park had taken the front seat, promptly falling asleep or pretending to, leaving Keisha and June alone in the back, separated by a few inches of leather seat but connected by the shared experience of the last 2 hours. June turned to her, the passing streetlights illuminating the sharp angles of his face, and signed slowly, his movements not as fluid as his mother's but careful and deliberate. "I am sorry for the man before. He was blind, not you." The car ride to her apartment was a blur of city lights and comfortable silence, the kind that usually takes months to establish in a new relationship, yet here it was, fully formed in the back of a sedan owned by a man who was clearly involved in organized crime. Keisha directed the driver to her building, a modest brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, and when they arrived, June insisted on walking her to the front door while the bodyguards waited by the car. Standing on her stoop, the height difference between them became more apparent, forcing her to look up into his dark, unreadable eyes. She felt a sudden surge of boldness, perhaps fueled by the wine or the adrenaline of the evening, and signed, "Thank you for saving my night." June shook his head, his hands moving with a grace that contradicted his dangerous aura, and signed back, "You saved us." "My mother has not smiled like that in a long time." He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering as if he wanted to touch her arm but decided against it, pulling back to maintain a respectful distance. "Good night, Keisha," he said aloud, ensuring she could read his lips perfectly, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating in a way she could feel in her chest. She watched him walk back to the car, his stride long and confident, and waited until the taillights disappeared around the corner before she unlocked her door. Inside her apartment, she leaned against the closed door, her heart racing, the silence of her home feeling different now, less lonely, but charged with anticipation. She touched her cheek where the warmth of his gaze had lingered, wondering if this was a singular, magical event or the beginning of something complicated and dangerous. 3 days passed before Keisha heard from him again, a period of time during which she tried to convince herself that the encounter had been a singular, dreamlike aberration in her otherwise ordinary life, but the memory of June's dark eyes and Mrs. Park's spirited signing refused to fade. On Tuesday morning, a delivery van that looked far too nondescript to be carrying anything of value pulled up to her office building, and a courier brought up a package wrapped in brown paper that was almost as tall as she was. Her co-workers watched with thinly veiled curiosity as she unwrapped it to reveal a magnificent, professional-grade easel made of dark walnut wood, accompanied by a set of paints that she knew had to be imported and incredibly rare. There was no card, only a small, heavy envelope containing a single piece of thick cardstock with a handwritten note in elegant, sharp script. "My mother complains the lighting in my home is terrible for art. She asks if you would come to dinner on Saturday to assess the walls. I will send a car at 7-inch." It was a command disguised as a request, yet the inclusion of his mother made it feel safe, a family invitation rather than an illicit proposition. When Saturday arrived, the same black sedan was waiting, and the driver, a burly man with a scar running through his eyebrow, greeted her with a respectful nod and a clumsy but sincere attempt at signing. "Hello." The drive took them away from the city center and up toward the cliffs overlooking the bay, where the houses were set far back from the road behind iron gates and high stone walls. June's home was a fortress of glass and concrete, stark and modern, standing in sharp contrast to the warmth she had felt from him in the car. As she stepped into the foyer, the silence was absolute, the kind of heavy quiet that money buys to keep the world out. But then, Mrs. Park came bustling around a corner, wearing a floral apron over a cashmere sweater, her face lighting up the moment she saw Keisha. She didn't offer a handshake. She pulled Keisha into a hug that smelled of sesame oil and expensive perfume, signing rapidly against Keisha's shoulder. "The house is too big, too quiet. You are here. Now it is good." June appeared a moment later at the top of the floating staircase, having traded his suit for a dark turtleneck and trousers, looking less like a mafia boss and more like a weary king returning to his sanctuary. He descended the stairs with his eyes fixed on Keisha, and for the first time, she noticed the tension in his shoulders drop, as if her presence was the signal that he could finally stop guarding the gates. Dinner at the estate was an intimate affair, served in a dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city lights shimmering below like scattered diamonds. The food was traditional Korean cuisine, endless banchan dishes, and a spicy stew that Mrs. Park proudly announced she had made herself, refusing to let the private chef touch the main course. The conversation flowed more easily this time, a unique triad of communication where Mrs. Park signed in a mix of Korean Sign Language and American Sign Language. Keisha responded in ASL, and June acted as the bridge when the dialects didn't overlap, his voice low and rumbling as he translated for his mother. However, the reality of June's world intruded halfway through the meal when a man in a suit entered the room, whispering something urgent into June's ear. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The gentle host vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating leader Keisha had glimpsed at the restaurant. June's face hardened into granite, his eyes turning void of emotion as he signed a sharp, curt command to his mother, "Stay," before standing up and leaving the room without looking at Keisha. The air in the room grew heavy, the silence suddenly oppressive rather than peaceful. Mrs. Park didn't look frightened. She looked resigned, a deep sadness settling in the lines around her mouth as she reached across the table to touch Keisha's hand. "He is a good man," she signed slowly, her movements lacking their usual bounce. "But he carries a heavy mountain on his back. He protects us, but the mountain is cold." Keisha squeezed the older woman's hand, feeling the calluses on her palm, and realized that this wasn't just a wealthy family. It was a family under siege, bound together by survival as much as love. She didn't run. Instead, she waited. When June returned 20 minutes later, he smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and the sharp tang of winter air, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of his chair. He looked at Keisha, expecting fear, expecting her to make an excuse and leave, but she simply picked up the water pitcher and refilled his glass. The surprise in his eyes was the most vulnerable thing she had ever seen. He sat down slowly, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for years, and signed, "I am sorry." Keisha shook her head, holding his gaze with unwavering steadiness, and signed back, "The mountain is heavy. You do not have to carry it at the dinner table." Months began to bleed into one another, marking a timeline not of dates on a calendar, but of small, significant milestones in a deepening relationship that defied all logic. Keisha became a fixture in the house on the cliffs, her presence bringing color to the monochrome world June inhabited. She set up her easel in the sunroom, the smell of turpentine and oil paint mingling with the scent of Mrs. Park's brewing tea. The dynamic of their found family solidified. Mrs. Park was the heart, beating loudly and demanding joy. June was the shield, standing between them and the chaos of his business, and Keisha became the anchor, the steady point of calm that held them both to the ground. She learned that June's business was a complex web of gambling, real estate, and protection that he had inherited from a father who had been far more ruthless and far less honorable. June was trying to legitimize it, to turn the ship around without sinking it, a dangerous game that left him exhausted and often bruised. There were nights he would come to her apartment late, collapsing onto her sofa, too tired to speak, just needing to be in a space where no one wanted anything from him. On one such evening, a thunderstorm had knocked out the power in her neighborhood, plunging her apartment into darkness. When June arrived, soaked from the rain, his security detail waiting in the street, he found her lighting candles. He watched her move in the flickering light, the silence of her world wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He didn't have to listen for footsteps or sirens here. He could just be. He sat on the floor beside her, watching the shadows dance on the walls. "Why do you stay?" he signed, the question heavy with his own insecurities. "My world is not safe." Keisha reached out, tracing the line of a scar on his jawline with her thumb, feeling the vibration of his pulse beneath her skin. "Because safety is not just about walls and guards," she signed back, her movements fluid in the candlelight. "It is about being seen. You see me. I see you." It was a declaration of love without using the word, a promise that she wasn't naive to the danger, but that he was worth the risk. June caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, closing his eyes as if he were saying a prayer of gratitude to a god he wasn't sure listened to men like him. The true test of their bond came in the autumn, when the leaves on the trees surrounding the estate turned the color of fire. Keisha was working in the sunroom while Mrs. Park napped in the armchair, a peaceful domestic scene that was shattered when the security alarms triggered, flashing lights that Keisha saw before she felt the vibration of the heavy steel shutters slamming down over the windows. She didn't hear the sirens, but she saw Mrs. Park wake with a start, eyes wide with a panic that Keisha had never seen before. June was not home. The protocol was clear: lockdown. Keisha found herself moving with a calmness that surprised her, guiding Mrs. Park to the safe room hidden behind the library bookshelves, a space she had been shown once, just in case, inside the reinforced windowless room. The air was stale and recycled. Mrs. Park was trembling, signing frantically about a rival faction, about June being a target. Keisha took the older woman's hands, stopping the frantic motion, and forced her to breathe, creating a rhythm of inhale and exhale that they shared. For 3 hours, they sat in the bunker, cut off from the world. Keisha used the time to tell stories with her hands, weaving tales of her childhood, of colors and light, distracting the mother from the terror of what might be happening to her son outside. When the door finally hissed open, it wasn't an enemy but June, his shirt torn and a bandage wrapped hastily around his forearm, sweat matting his hair to his forehead. He looked wild, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the 2 women sitting on the floor. He dropped to his knees, pulling them both into his arms, burying his face in Keisha's neck. He was shaking. It wasn't the adrenaline of the fight that shook him. It was the terror of what he could have lost. Later that night, while Mrs. Park slept under the influence of a sedative, June sat with Keisha while she cleaned the cut on his arm. The violence of his world had literally breached the walls, yet Keisha's hands were steady as she applied the antiseptic. "I should let you go," he signed, his movements jerky and pained. "I am selfish to keep you." Keisha finished taping the bandage, then took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You are not keeping me," she signed firmly. "I am staying." There is a difference. A year had passed since the night of the red dress and the blind date rejection, a full cycle of seasons that had transformed strangers into an inseparable unit. It was a crisp winter evening, and June had insisted on taking them back to the same bistro where they had met. The staff, now well acquainted with the boss and his family, had cleared the entire patio area for them, filling it with heaters and fairy lights that twinkled against the night sky. Mrs. Park was radiant in a new velvet dress, looking younger than she had in years, her laughter vibrating through the table as she recounted a story about June's childhood mischief. The ghost of the humiliated girl who had sat there 12 months ago was gone, replaced by a woman who knew she was cherished. As dessert arrived, a chocolate souffle that Mrs. Park clapped for, June stood up. He didn't look like the terrifying Mafia boss tonight. He looked nervous, smoothing his tie and shifting his weight. He walked around the table to where Keisha sat, and Mrs. Park went silent, her eyes shimmering with tears of anticipation. June knelt on one knee, not on the dirty floor of the restaurant, but on a small velvet cushion the waiter had slid into place. He didn't speak verbally. He wanted this moment to be entirely in her language. He raised his hands, his signing now fluent and graceful, honed by months of practice and love. "You taught me that silence is not empty," he signed, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "You filled my life with color. You saved my mother's heart, and then you saved mine." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring box, opening it to reveal a diamond that caught the fairy lights above and refracted them into 1,000 tiny rainbows, a vintage piece set in platinum that looked like woven vines, sturdy yet delicate. June continued signing, his hands trembling slightly. "I cannot promise a safe life, or a quiet one, but I promise a life where you are never unheard. Will you join us? Will you marry me?" The question hung in the cold air, warm and inviting, bridging the gap between her world and his. Keisha looked at the ring, then at Mrs. Park, who was openly weeping now, clutching her napkin to her mouth, and finally at June, whose stoic mask was completely gone, leaving only a man asking to be loved. The silence of her world was suddenly filled with the loudest yes she had ever felt. She didn't sign it immediately. She nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks, and pulled him up from the ground to kiss him, a desperate, affirming collision that sealed their future. The restaurant staff, who had been watching from the windows, broke into applause that Keisha couldn't hear but could see in their joyous faces and the vibrations of their clapping hands. Mrs. Park didn't wait for an invitation. She launched herself at them, wrapping her arms around both of them, creating a tangle of laughter, tears, and expensive fabric. As they sat back down, champagne being poured into flutes that caught the light, Keisha looked at her reflection in the dark bistro window again, just as she had done exactly 1 year ago. But the woman staring back wasn't lonely, humiliated, or rejected. She was radiant, flanked by a mother and a husband-to-be, surrounded by a love that didn't need a single spoken word to be understood. The simple question, "Can we join you?" that had started it all had transformed into "We are together." And for Keisha, looking at her found family in the glow of the winter lights, that was the only story that mattered.